Hello, everyone. Welcome to Music Industry 360 podcast by Symphonic Distribution. My name is Randall Foster. I am the Chief Creative Officer at Symphonic. And joining me today to discuss all things sync is Mr. John Mizrahi, who is head of sync at Bodega Sync. John, do you want to tell us a little bit about Bodega and what it is that you all do?
Sure. Bodega Sync was launched in 2019. It's a fully owned part of Symphonic Distribution, and we're the sync licensing arm. So we license a roster of independent artists, producers, record labels for film, TV, advertising, promos, trailers, video games, pretty much anything with a video component.
Awesome. And you've been at the sync game for quite some time now.
15 years, yeah.
You want to give us a little history there so we know what we're dealing with?
Sure. I've been doing this for 15 years. I previously worked for Carlin American Music Publishing, which is a family-owned music publishing company here in New York with an incredible evergreen catalog of copyrights, including James Brown, Meatloaf, Billie Holiday, Bobby Darin, the whole AC/DC catalog. And then my former boss also ran a management and sync licensing company with a focus on OneStop licensing, which is kind of where I cut my teeth, signing and licensing independent artists, which is kind of what I'm doing with Symphonic. So, obviously we represent lots of independent artists with a focus on making sure that their music is as uncomplicated to license as possible.
Awesome. For the crowd here, do you want to explain a little bit what you mean by OneStop?
Sure, absolutely. OneStop is kind of like an insider sync term, but it's meant to mean that licensing can all be done through one party. So typically, for any given song, you have the songwriters, and in some cases, if they have a publishing deal, a publisher representing the songwriters, or multiple publishers representing multiple songwriters. And then you have a recording that either belongs to the artist or a record label. And it could get pretty complicated pretty fast when there are lots of collaborators, lots of co-writers, things like that. So even for a complicated situation, a company like Bodega Sync can help aggregate all the rights and make it so that we essentially represent everybody. And so that from the perspective of the person trying to license the song, they send us a licensing request, we negotiate, we do the paperwork, and we license it without having to go to all these individual parties and all come to agreement on a number and to do the same paperwork with 10 different people.
So just to be clear, does everything Bodega represent have to be OneStop, or is there exceptions and things made from time to time, just for the crowd?
There are exceptions, but they're rare. Essentially, I would say at least 80% of our catalog is cleared as OneStop, and it's kind of the thing that we're known for. If we're representing something not as a OneStop, it's typically like a higher profile artist, in some cases, somebody who has a pre-existing publishing deal with a major, things like that. And then we work hand in hand with them on licensing requests. And, in some cases, if necessary, make sure that we're all on the same page so that things go smoothly. So it's still easy, but, there's just more people involved.
Very cool. Very cool. So obviously you've been in the sync licensing game for a while. I know things have changed. I know that, the landscape has changed. The outlets that are using content have changed. What do you think have been some of the most seismic changes over the last couple of years that you've witnessed?
So sync licensing definitely changes, but a lot of it sort of stays the same. I think that there's a certain amount of fixed nature of the type of music that tends to gravitate towards being useful in media. And that's stayed pretty constant. I think the things that have kind of changed trend-wise, I'm seeing a lot more focus on the artists over the song. So the song is still very important. The budget, the rights are all still quite important. But more and more, I'm starting to see, people who are telling stories that are set in a specific city or location, or with an artist with a certain epic background. And they want artists that help reflect and to bring authenticity to that story. And that's been kind of a newish thing. I think that in the past few years, having instrumental mixes, which is something that had always been important but never really mandatory, has become kind of mandatory. The reason being that if you don't have your instrumental mixes, they can't really make edits throughout dialogue, so that they can kind of bring the vocals in and out, so to speak, by creating a comp edit. And I've also seen those instrumental mixes become really valuable in advertising, where ad agencies really love using real artist material with the vocals taken out over existing just standalone instrumentals. I think mainly because they're sort of constructed and written in a way where, they have a carve out for where the vocals are. And when you take them out, it leaves a lot of space for voiceover and for dialogue and things like that. Beyond that, there's obviously a lot of people trying to use new technologies, to expand sync licensing into the metaverse and to use blockchain to solve some really complicated, pervasive problems in sync licensing, specifically, tracking who controls all the rights to music, which on the publishing side, as you well know, can be very complicated and rights change hands pretty frequently, and trying to make it so that there's sort of a centralized place where you can at least find out who has all the rights to a particular song is exceedingly complicated. And there's some very smart people who've been trying to work on creating technology-based solutions for that. I'm seeing international sync. Sync has always existed around the world, but now, especially throughout the pandemic, people have been more inclined to work remotely with people in different areas, throughout the country, but also throughout the world. And a lot of companies are making it really easy to partner together so that they can, rather than setting up offices around the world to represent stuff, you can sort of work with other people. There are lots of platforms that are coming online in recent years to make licensing very easy for sort of content creators who don't have huge budgets. So if you're making, like a small, local advertisement, or you're doing a podcast, you want really cool music, there are a lot of people who are coming up with, solutions to make that process really streamlined and uncomplicated, because it does require a lot of understanding of a very complicated business and a lot of paperwork and a lot of, sort of pre-preparation for that sort of thing. So those are a lot of the new things that I'm starting to see.
That's a lot. That's a great deal of change.
Sure. Yeah.
That's awesome. So let's dial back and back up a little bit and start talking about the music itself rather than the space at large. I'm an independent artist. I'm making music. What are some tips and tricks that I can employ to make sure that I have a greater chance of succeeding in sync, whether it be with Bodega or independently or however?
I think a lot of artists are reluctant to categorize themselves, and everyone thinks that they're a unique flower, and nobody wants to admit that their music sounds like someone else's music. But in the landscape of the amount of music that exists in the world right now, that's usually the easiest way for people to quickly understand what it is you do. So, if you make music that sounds, like Silk Sonic, that's like kind of throwback 70s stuff, and you're embarrassed that your music kind of sounds like this famous artist or whatever, and you try to explain that, like, oh, it pulls on classic soul. Like, classic soul is pretty broad, but so it's kind of like Silk Sonic. People are like, oh, okay, I understand what that is. Finding that niche, understanding what your music is about, understanding how to quickly communicate that to people, and if you are going to directly reach out to music supervisors, which may or may not work without a relationship, you want to bring them something that they need. And so understanding what they need, and specifically just doing your homework. If you are an artist that makes music like Silk Sonic, and there's a TV show that uses stuff like that, and you look on IMDb and you find out who the supervisor is, and you tweet at them and say, hey, I'm an artist that does this. And it's right on point, and it shows immediately that what kind of music they use in the production, and you are a person that makes that kind of music. And so now the supervisor's like, oh, maybe I should talk to you because you are the right person. If you are a techno artist and you pitch your music for a show that uses all indie rock, it immediately shows you have no idea what you're talking about, and you're just going to be shut out. Beyond that, I would also recommend, now that you know what the term OneStop means, it's always really good if you do control all your rights. If you're in a band and all of you collectively own the publishing and the master, or if you're a solo artist and you make all your stuff on a laptop, use the word OneStop, because that also will communicate to a music supervisor that they know what they're doing. But realistically, directly reaching out to supervisors and to ad agencies and things like that, they ignore most people. And so the reason that a sync rep or an agency exists is that we're trusted partners and we cultivate relationships with them, and we spend a lot of time ourselves digging into what they do. They send us briefs looking for specifically what they're looking for. So they solicit us for music in a way that they wouldn't ever do for an artist. And it's our job to essentially curate stuff for them. So that's usually the channel in which you'll be able to get your music into media. Now, in terms of finding a sync rep, I'd love to tell you that Bodega Sync is the perfect partner for everybody, but we're not. And there are lots of different companies that focus and specialize in certain things. And everybody has their roster, and everybody has holes in their roster. So for us, for instance, we have tons and tons of hip hop artists, we do a lot of business in the hip hop space. We're always open to it, but we have a lot of artists to begin with. There may be another comparable company that has fewer of them who might be more excited about signing any hip hop artist just because they don't have much on their roster. So understanding what a sync rep specializes in, looking at where their past placements were, looking at what their roster looks like, will give you an idea as to whether or not you're a good fit for them. For us also, we focus on one-stop rights. That's not necessarily everybody, so just understanding who your audience is, I think, is a really smart thing, whether you're going directly to a supervisor or you're going to a sync agency.
Awesome. So I'm curious, I think I know your answer on this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. In Nashville, in the music publishing space where I was at before I was here, often someone would bring a song to me and they would say, this is a really interesting song, but we don't know where it could go. So maybe you can pitch it for sync. And I had varying levels of success myself with those songs. And I always dialed back my own thought processes with regards to why things didn't work. As the authenticity of the music, of the art, wasn't locked in. And I know a lot of artists talk about writing sync songs and doing sync projects, but I'm curious your thoughts. How important is authenticity in the art? There are a lot of really talented musicians who can write in all genres and all styles. But where do you think that line between sheer talent and authenticity resides?
That's a really great question. I mean, there is definitely a space for sync artists, and there are sync artists that do incredibly well. But I think that it's becoming more and more difficult for them to find a space, because I think that there are very few artists that can do that kind of thing and still come off as authentic. So if you write in 10 different genres, you might be good enough that you can authentically do all of that, even if you don't necessarily come from those scenes or whatever. There are just some people who are just brilliant. And, you can say to them, like, having never written a country song, like, write me a country song. And they do a little bit of listening to some country music and they just absorb what the essence of what it is. And they write a brilliant country song. Those people are few and far between. Most people, they realistically just know one thing really well. They have a lane or whatever. And I think that also coming from a place in a background where you are authentic is more likely to help you resonate with something and sing. So I think that there's a space for those types of artists. I think there's a lot of people who say that they can write for sync, and they can't. In the same way that, like, there's a lot of people, anybody can go hang out with any group of people. Whether or not you're going to fit in comes down to what kind of personality you have. So in this case with the songwriting, if you are going to step out into a space that you're not familiar with, you better be a damn good songwriter. And the songs themselves better have enough weight to transcend the fact that maybe you're not, like, authentically, an artist from the genre that you're sort of writing in. Another thing is, if you write a brilliant song and it's outside the genre, maybe finding a performer, to record your song is really the right way to do it. So if you write a brilliant country song, but you're a shitty, country artist, you're not a good singer, you might want to find somebody who's not a great songwriter and partner up with them and say, listen, I need a vessel for this song. And you have the authenticity and the good songwriting, which is how music used to be made back in the day. You used to have professional songwriters writing songs for professional artists and recording artists. And now, since the Beatles, everybody's just trying to do everything themselves. Some people do that really brilliantly and it's amazing. And other people are better at one thing or another. And, their weaknesses, detract from the overall, appeal of their music.
Does releasing your music commercially affect the curb appeal of your authenticity?
It gives people context and maybe a metric to evaluate whether or not you're a real artist. We represent some producers who make music that is focused on sync, but they do it exceptionally well, and they write stuff that we just don't have otherwise. And so my preference would be to have authentic artists who do all that kind of stuff, but nobody's come to me with music quite as good as what they make. And I recommended to them that they create artist personas around it and to release the stuff through Spotify so that it's there, so that it looks like real artists. And it gives us the ability to say, this is not a huge artist, but this is like an under the radar real artist, as opposed to saying, this is like, bodega production music or whatever you want to call it. That's sort of this generic kind of thing. I think releasing the music is not a requirement. If you're an artist and you have like following and you have a listenership, releasing the music will definitely elevate, the profile of it. It may add value to the song itself, but depending on what kind of music, it may also date it. So, you also have a situation where, you may have a record that sounds perfectly 2022, but it was released in 2017, and a supervisor might see that and be like, that's an old record. And that may detract from whether or not they want to use it. Every supervisor and every production has their own sort of criteria. Some people don't care about that. Some people only want brand new music. We get briefs sometimes saying, only send us stuff that isn't out yet. That's going to be that you have a release planned for 6 months from now, so that we know that it's going to be really fresh and really new. So there's not any one answer to that. There are benefits to releasing it. There are benefits to not releasing it because it becomes ageless. And then as long as you're able to tie it to an artist, you can say, well, this is like an unreleased or pre-release track. And then it gives the music supervisor like, okay, well, this is going to be something that's going to be out. And if we can place it correctly, it'll be coming out when the show like airs. And the marketing from both of them can sort of, elevate each other. So that could be an attractive thing. We represent a lot of unreleased music, and I kind of prefer it, to be honest.
Really? Well, it seems like there could be a lot of strategy where the sync could actually help the music perform digitally, et cetera. And
being part of a distributor is a really great place to be when you're talking about representing, unreleased stuff. We can very quickly put a release plan together. Get marketing together. I mean, if it's something that it's a huge placement, if it's going to be an ad on TV or something like that, that's a huge marketing driver. And so, getting things up on DSPs and putting a strategy together is something obviously that we specialize in. So
awesome. Let's talk about a little bit more with regards to the global picture of sync. From my former days in sync, I remember there were bands that kind of had a season. Like the Black Keys for a while were everything. Every time I heard of a need musically, it was, something like the Black Keys, and Mumford and Sons had their season, and Imagine Dragons, and then Kanye West's Black Skinhead. And are you seeing stylistically any trends right now that it might be, not that, obviously artists in the crowd, if you change your genre and your style completely to chase this trend, you're already late. But for those who might already be in the genre, that might already have something that lines up like that, is there something you're seeing a pattern with musically with regards to requests lately? Less
and less, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I wish I could say that we didn't get references that you could trace back to Black Keys, meaning like riffy swagger rock. That has been a fixture in sync for over a decade, and it's still a thing. They don't necessarily just reference Black Keys, I think probably because it's become like such a tired reference at this point. But I mean that there is something inherent in that is kind of timeless, which is like attitude and confidence, and that crosses and transcends genres. I've seen a lot more focus on like hip hop and R&B, which are hugely diverse genres in and of itself. I mean, hip hop, R&B, and electronic music, are really almost like useless labels at this point because there's such a range stylistically of what they could be. But I think that, they're really important for the sound that a lot of productions are kind of, seeking right now. I think less about, and it's difficult. You and I both come from a publishing background, focus on songs. I think that people give too much attention to genre and like who someone sounds like and those types of trends, and don't think enough about what their songs are about. There are a lot of absolutely brilliant artists, some that we represent, who write songs and I can't figure what they're about. I read the lyrics and I'm like, these are just words. They're interesting, nice sounding words. They work really well in music, but they don't say anything. And I think that people have strayed away from writing those types of songs. And I think that the people who write those kinds of songs that don't necessarily tell a story, but can be used in a way to help support a story. So I always tell people in terms of songwriting that the things that work across all media, you have to understand that a production, no matter if it's a commercial or a film or a TV show, or even a video game, anything, they are telling a story through the visual media. And they want the music to create a vibe, but they also want the words to make some sense. And they don't want it to be literal. They don't want it to be, a story, where like, it's a war scene and the lyrics are like, it's so hard to be in war. Like, it's too on the nose. They want, they want a song that talks about the feelings, and the song could not be about war. The song could be about, heartbreak after a breakup. But as long as it doesn't mention the breakup and it's focused on the emotion, those are the same emotions of loss, of whatever it is. So I think that making sure that your songs connect to universal human emotions and feelings and themes is really important. And it's something that I feel like a lot of artists don't pay enough attention to. The trends, like you said, you can't chase the trends. Even with us, with signing artists, we're pretty nimble, in terms of being able to say we're noticing that like Zydeco music is having a moment. We can go grab a bunch of Zydeco artists, and by the time we have our deals in place, that moment is over.
So ready for Zydeco to have a moment.
Me too. It'd be great.
You make a really great point though, and I've for years have coached songwriters on how to do what they do better for sync. And I feel like I've been a broken record, but I've always stood by the fact that human emotion is a universal thing, and it doesn't matter what salary you make, what continent you live on. Happiness is happiness, sadness is sadness. I refer to them personally as big tent concepts, big tent emotions. And I used to always use Pharrell's Happy as kind of a, like, happy is like it's a nothing song. It's a
song about an emotion.
It's a word salad about just being happy.
Yeah.
And
nobody writes those.
But my God, it worked. And it worked. It worked in that film, and it worked in gazillions of other places. And it's now, gosh, probably 10 times platinum.
Yeah.
But it
was a song from a film.
It really was. It really is an interesting song, because if you listen to the lyric structure, it doesn't read like a book. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. They never tell you why you're happy.
Yeah, which maybe people don't need that explanation on their emotion. I mean, but it's interesting to hear you say that though, with regards to music at large, in kind of pulling back into those pillars of emotion versus right now Billie Eilish is really having a moment. More emotional pop female vocal stuff would be really great.
I'm a huge Billie Eilish fan, and her songs are incredibly well constructed, and they have that same thing. From what I understand, she grew up in a household where she's like homeschooled, and her parents taught her and her brother songwriting. Like they like literally like had structured songwriting classes. So it's not accidental. She's not just like some accidental genius. She was raised from a young age to like think about song structure and things like this. I think that education is hard to come by. I know that you're an educator in this field as well, but like there's just not that many spaces for artists to practically learn songwriting as a craft. And so I think that they copy people that they admire, which is fine, but they maybe sometimes lose the underlying craft of how to write a song that really resonates with people. And they're really focused on trying to like create a vibe with their music, which has its place also. There's nothing wrong with that. But like you said, if your lyrics are word salad, it's going to be really hard to sing, unless it's meant to just be really super background. Yeah. If you want something that's going to really carry and help accentuate a storyline, you want it to have some sort of a universal theme. Like you said about happy is interesting, because song Happy never tells you what anyone's happy about, and so it could be about anything. You could be happy about winning the lottery. You could be happy about buying a new car. You could be happy about falling in love. You can be happy with insert anything that you're happy about, and that song could be about it. And that's a great way to write a song.
I think artistically, I think more artists should ask themselves why. Why did I write this song? What am I getting at with it? And that's a hard artistic question to ask. It really is.
What will this song mean to anyone else?
Yeah, it really is a tough question to ask. I think you and I could riff on this for probably another 2 hours. Sure. We're kind of running out of time, and there are a couple items I do want to cover with you, because I do think, as we talked about the seismic change kind of in the sync space, one of those I've witnessed even on the outside of it really has been the kind of decentralized formats that we're seeing now. Whereas a couple of years ago, it was TV, film, ads, video games. That was really pretty much it. Non-traditional stuff, but non-traditional was such a small slice of the pie, it didn't really account for much. But now we have new players in this space like TikTok and things like that that are actually being used in an advertising sense by brands. Can you give a quick landscape of that and kind of what that looks like and feels like to you? That, and then in addition to that, as a sidebar, the advent of the IPTV situation with, Netflix and Amazon and Hulu doing original productions. Has that really affected and changed the way you do things, or are there just more viable targets today than there were 10 years ago?
There are more viable targets for sure. The targets are much more diverse, I think. I think that the types of stories that you can, it's kind of like network TV, and then you had cable, and cable for many years was like they just played movies, and then HBO, Showtime, they started producing original content, and that original content was weightier and more cinematic and higher production value and kind of more interesting and edgy than anything that was on television. And they could use curse words and they can have sex scenes and like all this kind of stuff. And then streaming, I think, is taking it like another level. And I think that it's such a huge business, and there's so much money in these subscription models that you have dozens of companies producing really interesting content, and they can do it. They're not based on like a traditional television schedule. They're not thinking about like, well, how's this going to do at the box office? And they could take bigger risks, and they can bring in stories that probably the traditional studio and network system would have never given a moment to, because they're not money makers. But you put that content out on Netflix, and then you have like these sudden like viral series that just absolutely take off. There's, this is not like a music thing, but just as an example, there's like a new series hosted by Mikey Day called Is It Cake? And it's a game show about like cake makers who make things, and like, is it cake?
I have seen that.
You probably would never get that on TV. Like, you need, someone to be like, that's weird, let's do it. And I think that, not just weird, but, you have like international filmmakers and series in other languages. I've watched so many things in the last, like during the pandemic, I was like watching shows in French and Hebrew and all this kind of stuff. And, in order to access these things, you have to really kind of delve into like foreign culture. And now it's just like, oh, just on Netflix, just go like that. And I think that all of those productions offer the ability for people who make music that's outside the mainstream to find a voice. People who make music in other languages, like even though these productions are mostly originating from the United States, it's not all in English. It's not all about white people, and it's not just like the same kind of stories that we've been seeing, for such a long time. And it's giving voices to a lot of different types of people. In terms of TikTok that you mentioned, I was talking to somebody about this recently, that it's interesting that TikTok is just by definition similar to a commercial in and of itself, right? It's a short form media. A commercial is 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute. And you got to put as much stuff in there as you can. That's why you see these pharmaceutical ads and, like may cause internal bleeding. They're talking really fast. And they're trying to get lots of stuff in there. And they're trying to make a story happen. It's like a mini film. And they have to just compress all this stuff into this very small space. And TikTok is the same thing, but without the constraints of it having to sell a product. And so you have this format where people are being hugely creative in such a small format. And it's done the same thing to songs, right? So for commercials, you would take a whole big song and you have an editor come in and chop it up and say, how do we make this into something that tells a story in a short period of time? And now you have not commercial editors, people who are just making funny videos or interesting, whatever. And they're zoning in on these certain types of songs that is like, this song goes, oh no, and they're like, oh, that could be about anything. Like anytime something goes wrong, you say the oh no song, or like another song goes big, and every time there's a big thing, it's so it's interesting how it's giving new context to these like short form edited songs, and that's also driving like the music industry. Songs are taking off and becoming hit songs through TikTok. From a sync perspective, TikTok is not really a rich sync environment because nobody's really licensing any of this stuff unless it's specifically crafted as an advertisement, and even then, people are creating advertising content with music, but in a lot of cases, they may or may not be licensing it because there's a permissive sort of ability for music to be used, in that context. In some cases, they may be clearing it just to cover themselves, but in a lot of cases, the TikTok rights are part of a larger multimedia ad campaign. So yeah, I mean, it's a target-rich environment. There's a lot of opportunities for this. I mean, the metaverse is probably next, and very smart people are having discussions and trying to figure out how licensing is going to work there. Yeah, it's exciting. It's an exciting future. I mean, the things have evolved quite a bit. And I think people are all still trying to figure a lot of this out. But in the meantime, there is absolutely no shortage of opportunities for music to be used in these contexts, and it's our job to make sure the artists get paid for it.
Awesome. Speaking of opportunities, I'd be remiss if I didn't let you do a little bit of a humble brag here on some of the things that you're really proud of that you've accomplished recently with Bodega. Are there a deal or two that stick out in terms of that you'd like to share?
I don't know that there's any like one specific thing, but I will say that in the last year or so, we've gotten to the point where we're doing enough licensing and enough business, and we're representing artists that music supervisors are kind of attracted to inherently, and that we're not doing as much outreach and selling, and we're doing a lot more incoming kind of business, which is kind of the natural evolution of a business. We've started doing business with music supervisors that were very, very difficult to impress early on. There are people that I've known for a long time. And even with my relationships with them, whether or not they engage with us has everything to do with what we have for them. So when we started out, we had like 10 to 15 artists that nobody had ever heard of. It's a tough sell to be like, hey, let's have a conversation about what I could put in your show. And now, with about 10,000 plus tracks, most of which are really easy to license, and really, really high quality music. I mean, again, in terms of our curation, we're obsessively picky. Even from Symphonic, with a huge amount of releases available to us, we represent like less than 1% of their overall, releases. And it's allowed us to curate a really strong roster and to have specialization in certain genres. And probably the most thing I'm proud of, recently we had a huge run of licenses in All American and the new spinoff All American Homecoming, which is a huge hit show. It's music supervised by Madonna Wade Reed, somebody I've known for a long time. And I worked very hard to impress her with our music, and pitched her, pretty much from the start at Bodega, and things really just connected this year. And she gave us like 10 or so licenses, and she supervised lots of shows. And these were all like really big placements for us. And it's just to me, it's a huge accomplishment, because it's as soon as you open the door with someone like her who doesn't just supervise one show, she's doing a lot of stuff. She's very influential. She's the second in command at the Guild of Music Supervisors, like a huge organization. We've started to see a lot of music supervisors who weren't that interested in working with us on day one. And now where we're at, they're seeking us out and they're coming after our music. And it's really exciting to see that.
Great. Bravo with that.
Thank you.
We are about out of time here, but I wanted to say thank you so much for joining me today, John, and for illuminating the world of sync for our listeners. If people want to know more, where should they go?
Bodegasync.com. That's Bodega, Bodega, sync, SYNC with no H.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for participating today and for sharing your knowledge with us. And to our listeners, stay tuned. There's going to be more episodes coming on more subject matter and with some great executive interviews here moving forward. Once again, I'm Randall Foster, Chief Creative Officer of Symphonic, and it's my absolute pleasure to have spent the last half hour with you, and I hope you'll join us again.